The air in the archive was a silent, patient thing, thick with the scent of aging paper and something else, a dry, almost mineral dust that settled on every surface, a fine powder of forgotten time. My world, for the most part, existed within that quietude. Each morning I would unlock the heavy oak door, the click echoing unnaturally loud, and step into the hushed reverence of countless lives meticulously catalogued. I was an archivist, a keeper of echoes, and my precision was my creed. Today, my task was the Henderson collection, a sprawling assortment of correspondence, ledgers, and photographs from a family of regional industrialists spanning 2 centuries. It was a tedious, yet deeply satisfying process, separating brittle letters from their envelopes, flattening curled photographs with careful weights, noting every tear, every faded signature. Each item had a specific place, a designated box, a precise shelf coordinate. Order was paramount. Without it, history was just noise. The only disruption to this methodical rhythm was the low, persistent hum that vibrated up from the building's foundations. It was the ancient heating system, a relic itself, and a constant companion to my work. Sometimes the hum would falter, sputter, or escalate into a rattling groan demanding attention. When it did, it meant a trip to the building's underbelly. Around mid-afternoon, a particularly aggressive clanking started, shaking the floorboards beneath my desk. It wasn't the usual low thrum. This was a protest. I sighed, setting down the magnifying glass I'd been using to decipher a particularly cramped margin note. The archive's superintendent, a man who believed in the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" philosophy even when things were clearly, audibly broken, was probably off-site. That left me. Again, I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the utility closet and made my way towards the stairwell leading down. The light in the stairwell was always dim, a single flickering bulb casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank with each step. The air grew cooler as I descended, then abruptly warmer, carrying the faint, metallic tang of heart machinery. The clanking grew louder, punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of escaping steam. The door to the boiler room in basement was a thick, steel slab painted a peeling industrial green. It shuddered with the vibrations from within. I pushed it open, stepping into a cavern of heat and noise. The air was thick and close, smelling of hot metal, stale water, and something else, something vaguely acrid like old oil. 3 massive, cylindrical boilers dominated the space, their gauges and pipes a tangled, intimidating web. One of them, the largest, was responsible for the cacophony. A pressure valve was stuck, spewing steam in short, violent bursts. I knew enough from previous impromptu repairs to give the valve a sharp, decisive tap with the heel of my hand. The clanking eased, the steam hiss softened to a steady whisper. The hum of the system settled back into its familiar, low thrum. Success. I stood for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, dusty light filtering through a high, grimy window. My gaze drifted over the shelves lining one wall, piled with spare parts, old tools, and a haphazard collection of discarded office supplies. My attention snagged on a small wooden crate tucked behind a stack of rusted pipes. It looked out of place, not like the usual maintenance detritus. Curiosity, a dangerous trait for an archivist whose job was to preserve rather than disturb, nudged me forward. It wasn't heavy, just dusty. Inside, nestled amongst some brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1950s, was a single, unbound photograph. My gloved fingers, usually so precise, hesitated as I picked it up. It was old, certainly, a faded sepia print, but something about it immediately felt wrong. It wasn't just the age. The photograph depicted a street scene, perhaps a market or a bustling town square. The buildings were unmistakably Victorian, horse-drawn carriages visible in the background, figures in period dress milling about. But in the foreground, impassably, was a solitary figure. It stood unnaturally tall, slender to the point of gauntness, and its form seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. What truly arrested me, though, was the context. The figure was standing next to what looked like a modern street lamp, the kind with a curved arm and a distinct, almost alien LED fixture. It was an impossibility, a ghost in the machine of history. My meticulous mind immediately flagged it. Anachronism, a glaring, undeniable error. I turned the photograph over. No markings, no date, no photographer's stamp, nothing. The paper felt thick, almost like cardstock, and had a peculiar, slightly rough texture. It wasn't just a misplaced prop in a historical reenactment. The figure felt present, like it was looking back, even through the faded sepia and the years. I tucked the photograph carefully into the inside pocket of my work coat. I left the crate, the old newspapers, and the lingering scent of stale oil behind, shutting the heavy steel door with a soft clang that resonated through the concrete. Back in the archive, the familiar smell of old paper no longer felt comforting. I pulled out the photograph again, laying it flat on my desk next to a perfectly preserved 1888 land deed. The contrast was stark. The clarity of the deed, its precise script and official stamps, marked the blurry, impassable image. My earlier satisfaction with the Henderson collection, with the neat order of the past, had evaporated. This was no mere misfiling. This was an intrusion, a thread pulled from the fabric of time, disrupting the perfect weave. I had a feeling my quiet, predictable world had just become a little less predictable and a lot less safe. Each morning, I would unlock the heavy oak doors, the brass lock groaning in protest, and step into the hushed reverence of the past. The photograph, the one depicting that distorted, unsettling scene, had burrowed itself into the quiet corners of my mind. I had tucked it back into its folder, amidst the innocuous records of the 1890s, with a deliberate, almost defiant precision. It had to be an anomaly, a misfiled item, a prank, perhaps, from a bored former archivist with a morbid sense of humor. The archive, a bastion of factual accuracy, simply didn't harbor such spectral curiosities. I told myself it was an old, damaged plate, the distortions merely artifacts of decay, the shadowy figure a trick of light on an overexposed negative. My rational mind, honed by years of cataloging and verification, demanded a logical explanation. And I would find one. I always did. For a few days, I managed to push the image to the periphery. I immersed myself in the meticulous work of rehousing the vast collection of early 20th century municipal records, a task requiring unwavering focus. The rhythmic rustle of brittle parchment, the soft click of acid-free clips, the muted thud of heavy ledgers, these were my anchors. Then came the flickering. It started subtly, in the far corner of the main reading room, where an antique brass lamp stood sentinel over a row of oak carrels. A brief stutter in its incandescent glow, a fleeting dip into shadow, then back to full brightness. I attributed it to the building's ancient wiring, a common complaint in a structure of this age. But it grew more frequent, more insistent. The other archivists, engrossed in their own work, didn't seem to notice, or perhaps they were simply accustomed to the quirks of the old building. But I noticed. I felt the tiny shifts in illumination, the way the air seemed to thicken and thin with each pulse of the light. One afternoon, as I was guiding a visiting researcher through the microfiche room, the flickering intensified into a violent seizure. The brass lamp in the reading room, visible through the glass partition, began to flicker so rapidly it seemed to be convulsing. The researcher, an elderly woman with kind eyes, gave a small gasp. "Oh dear," she murmured. "Another fuse, I suppose." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "I'll see to it," I managed, excusing myself. The old circuit box for that section of the building was, of course, located in the boiler room in the basement, a place I usually avoided. It was a labyrinth of hissing pipes, clanking machinery, and a pervasive, humid heat that clung to the air. The descent into the boiler room in the basement was always a sensory assault after the hushed quiet of the archive. The air grew heavy and thick, smelling of hot metal, damp concrete, and something vaguely acrid like burnt oil. My fingers, usually steady, fumbled with the cold metal latch. I reset the tripped breaker, the click echoing unnervingly in the mechanical symphony. As I turned to leave, a glint of something caught my eye, wedged between a rusty pipe and the crumbling brickwork of the foundation. It was a photograph. My breath hitched. The print was smaller than the first, perhaps 3 by 5 inches, and curled at the edges, as if it had been exposed to heat or damp for a long time. My heart, which I had convinced myself was merely reacting to the sudden heat of the boiler room, began a rapid, insistent thump against my ribs. I picked it up. The image was grainy, black and white, and instantly, horribly familiar. It depicted the very corner of the main reading room where the brass lamp stood. And there, in the background, half obscured by the flickering light, was it. The figure seemed to be watching the lamp, its posture one of silent, patient observation. But what truly froze me, what made the blood drain from my face, was a detail I hadn't consciously registered until this moment. The lamp in the photograph was not merely flickering, it was exploding. A tiny, almost imperceptible crack snaked across the glass of the bulb, and a faint wisp of smoke, like a phantom's breath, curled from its base, the exact incident that had just occurred. My mind wrestled with the implications. This wasn't a historical document. This wasn't a prank. The first photo I could rationalize as a strange antique, but this was too precise, too specific. It depicted an event that had unfolded mere minutes ago, an event I had just witnessed, an event that had sent me down into this suffocating space. The logical explanations, my meticulously constructed defenses, crumbled like dry paper. This wasn't just a misfiled item, it was a mirror, or worse, a prelude. The archive, once my sanctuary of order and truth, now felt like a vast, silent maw, slowly swallowing the edges of my reality. The faint hum of the boiler room in the basement, once just background noise, now sounded like a low, guttural growl. The air, heavy with the scent of metal and damp, suddenly felt impassably thick, pressing down on me, as if the very atmosphere itself was trying to choke the breath from my lungs. I clutched the photograph, its edges digging into my palm, and stumbled back towards the steep, narrow stairs, desperate to escape the suffocating heat and the impassable truth it had just revealed. The air in the boiler room in the basement was a thick, wet blanket, clinging to my skin with the scent of hot metal and something else, something vaguely organic and decaying, like old leaves pressed into damp earth. Each breath felt heavy, tasting faintly of rust. Pipes snaked overhead, a tangle of corroded copper and iron hissing softly as steam bled from invisible cracks. The floor, slick with condensation, glistened under the single bare bulb that swung precariously from a frayed cord, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the rhythmic clatter of an unseen pump. I hugged myself, despite the oppressive heat, and navigated the narrow passages between hulking, grumbling machinery. This place was a forgotten lung of the building, exhaling a constant sigh of forgotten time. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, searching for the ancient circuit box. The hum of the industrial equipment vibrated up through my soles, a low, guttural thrum that settled deep in my chest. Finally, tucked behind a massive, dormant furnace, I found it. A rectangular metal box, its paint flaking, a spiderweb of dust coating its surface. As I reached for the latch, my fingers brushed against something stiff, tucked into a crevice between the box and the rough concrete wall. It felt like paper. My stomach clenched. I pulled it free. It was another photograph. This one was different. Sharper, clearer, a stark black and white image that seemed to suck the light from the dim bulb. It depicted a narrow, unlit corridor, unmistakably part of this very building, though I couldn't place the exact location. In the foreground, sprawled awkwardly on the grimy floor, was a figure, and standing over them, impassably tall and indistinct, was it. My breath hitched. The air in the boiler room suddenly felt too thin. I stared at the photo, then at the circuit box, then back at the photo. The temporal connection was screaming at me now. The first photo, the historical event, then the second, the construction accident, and now this. And I was holding the evidence before it happened. I shoved the photo into my pocket, my hand trembling, and fumbled with the circuit box. The switch clicked with a dull thud, and I heard the distant hum of the section I'd been sent to revive. I didn't linger. I scrambled out, my steps echoing too loudly on the concrete stairs, not daring to look back. Back in the archives, the cool, dry air felt like a balm, but the image was burned into my mind. I found the archivist's supervisor, a man named Miller, meticulously shelving a collection of ancient maps. His movements were precise, almost mechanical. "Mr. Miller," I began, my voice rougher than I intended. I found something disturbing. He turned, a faint frown creasing his brow. "Kai, everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's about the anomalies," I pressed, pulling the 3 photos from my pocket, laying them carefully on the wide, dust-free table. The first, the blurred historical scene. Second, the construction collapse. They're predictions. This one, I tapped the boiler room photo. I found it just now in the basement. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. Miller adjusted his spectacles, picking up the photos one by one. He studied the first, then the second, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. But when he reached the third, the corridor, his expression hardened. "Kai, this is unsettling, I agree. But this looks like an amateur manipulation. A hoax, perhaps, slipped into the archives by some prankster. A prankster who can predict the future," I countered, my voice rising. "A prankster who knows where to hide these before the events occur. The construction collapse happened a day after I found that photo. This one, this figure, it's in all of them. It's not a prank, Mr. Miller. It's real." He sighed, placing the photos back on the table with deliberate slowness. "Kai, I understand I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. This archive can be isolating, and the old documents, sometimes they play tricks on the mind. Stress, perhaps. I've been working long hours on the West Wing collection." He even offered a small, placating smile. "We can reassign I to something less demanding for a few days if I like." My heart sank. He wasn't listening. He saw a stressed archivist, not a person holding undeniable proof of something deeply wrong. "Please, just consider it," I pleaded, gathering the photos, feeling their unnatural weight in my hand. "Just keep an eye out for anything unusual." He merely nodded, already turning back to his maps, dismissing my plea with the efficient indifference of a man who dealt in facts, not premonitions. I was alone in this. The rest of the day was a blur of heightened senses. I felt watched, not just by the figure in the photos, but by the very air around me. Later that afternoon, deep in the silent, dust-filled stacks of the oldest section, I was retrieving a fragile ledger from the late 1800. Its leather cover was brittle, its pages yellowed with age. As I carefully slid it from its shelf, a small, folded piece of paper fluttered from between its leaves, landing silently on the worn wooden floorboards. My breath caught. I didn't want to pick it up. I knew what it was, but I had to. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. This photo was even more explicit, more horrifying than the last. It was in color, though muted, as if drained of life. The scene was sickeningly clear. A human hand, severed at the wrist, lay on a polished floor. It wasn't observing this time. It seemed to be walking away. The perspective was low, as if taken from the floor itself, and the floor. The pattern of the tiles, the faint reflection of the high windows. It was the main hall of the archives. Our main hall. My own hand, still holding the photo, felt alien, detached. The temporal connection was no longer just undeniable. It was a noose tightening around my throat. It was here now. It was happening. The figure was not just in the past, not just predicting the future. It was here in the building, leaving its grotesque marks. And it was watching me, knowing I would find them, knowing I would see. I was not just an observer anymore. I was part of its game. Every creak of the old building's timbers felt like a personal accusation. Every whisper of air through the vents, a mocking laugh. The archive, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. My conversation with the director, his polite dismissal of my desperate pleas, had left a raw, exposed nerve. He merely nodded, already turning back to his maps, dismissing my plea with the efficient indifference of a man who dealt in facts, not premonitions. I felt a cold knot of despair tighten in my chest. The scent of aging paper, usually comforting, now carried a faint, cloying sweetness like decay. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to throb with an unseen rhythm, a pulse that wasn't my own. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by a person, but by something formless, something that seeped from the very walls. It wasn't enough to just look at the photographs. I needed to find more, to understand the pattern, to find anything that could explain this impossible horror. The archives held countless secrets, forgotten corners. If these photos were truly anachronistic, truly hidden, then perhaps there were others, deeper within the building's forgotten spaces. It wasn't just curiosity. It was a desperate, almost animalistic urge to seek out the source of my torment. My gaze kept drifting towards the heavy, bolted door at the far end of the basement corridor, the one marked with a faded, hand-painted sign, "Boiler Room Authorized Personnel Only." I'd never had a reason to go in there. It was a place of forgotten machinery, of dust and heat. The lock groaned as I forced the ancient key, a spare I'd found in a forgotten drawer in the director's office, to turn. The air was thick, humid, a cloying blanket. I stepped inside, the door hissing shut behind me, plunging me into a dim, orange glow cast by a single, caged bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. The boiler room in basement was a symphony of industrial misery. Massive, rust-streaked boilers dominated the space, their surfaces radiating a fierce, dry heat. Pipes, thick as my arm, snaked across the ceiling and walls, groaning and hissing with unseen pressure. Water dripped rhythmically into a shallow puddle on the concrete floor, a monotonous counterpoint to the deep, resonant rumble of the machinery. The air tasted of hot metal, damp concrete, and a faint, acrid oil. Every vibration from the floor traveled up my legs, making my teeth ache. I moved slowly, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes scanning every nook and cranny. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, a silent, swirling blizzard. I checked behind stacks of old pipes, under workbenches piled high with corroded parts, my heart thrumming against my ribs. This was foolish, I knew. What could possibly be here? Then, tucked into a crevice between a particularly large boiler and a crumbling brick wall, I saw it. My hand trembled as I reached for it, pulling it free. My fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the brittle edges. I wiped away the dust, holding it closer to the dim light. The image solidified, and a gasp tore from my throat. It wasn't a historical event, not a public tragedy. It was my apartment building. My street. The photograph showed the familiar brick facade of my building, specifically the ground floor window of my neighbor, the elderly woman who always left a bowl of water out for stray cats. The street lamp outside cast a sickly yellow glow on the pavement. It was taller, perhaps, or merely seemed so against the familiar backdrop. But this time it was different. It was looking. Its formless head was tilted, its empty gaze fixed, not on the building, not on the street, but out of the photograph, directly at me. It wasn't just a prediction anymore. It was an acknowledgement. It knew I was watching. It was watching me back. The timestamp, faintly visible in the bottom corner, indicated tomorrow night. My mind reeled. This was personal. This was my world, my neighbor. The creature wasn't just showing me history. It was invading my present, threatening those around me. I couldn't let it happen. I wouldn't. My hands clenched around the photograph. I had to act. I had to prevent this. I raced out of the boiler room in basement, the metallic stench clinging to my clothes, my footsteps echoing through the silent archive. I had to warn her or somehow protect that cat. I had tried to talk to the elderly neighbor earlier, making up a flimsy excuse about a strange noise I'd heard. He had smiled kindly, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand. "Oh, Kai, it's just the wind," he'd said, "nothing to worry about." Now, as dusk deepened, I watched. The street lamp flickered on, casting its familiar yellow pool. My gaze darted between the neighbor's window and the spot beneath the lamp. It curled up on the sill, settling in for the night. This was it. I had to do something. I couldn't let the prediction come true. I sprinted across the street, my shoes slapping against the pavement, my breath ragged. "Hey!" I yelled, waving my arms, trying to scare the cat away, to draw attention to myself, to avert whatever was coming. "Get out of here!" My sudden movement startled the tabby. I stood there, panting, a triumphant surge of adrenaline rushing through me. I had done it. I had changed the future. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. Not under the lamp, but inside the neighbor's apartment. Not a shattering window, but a slow, deliberate creak from within the apartment, followed by a muffled thud. The light in the neighbor's window, which had been on, suddenly winked out. The cat was safe, yes, but my interference hadn't stopped the event. It had merely shifted it. I hadn't prevented the horror. I had merely pushed it inside, made it more intimate, more terrifying. It was already in. And my actions, my desperate attempt to save a life, had only served to distract, to facilitate, to make the outcome worse. The creature wasn't just predicting. It was playing with me. And I was losing. Badly. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The adrenaline, so potent just moments before, curdled into a bitter dread. The tabby hadn't been under the shelf. No, it had darted away from something else. I hadn't seen it fully, just the impression of a deeper blackness, a ripple in the air that faded as quickly as it appeared. It was a phantom limb of vision, a ghost of a glimpse, but it was enough. I hadn't changed the future. I had merely agitated the present. The realization galvanized me. This wasn't a game, not a series of unfortunate coincidences. This was a direct, malevolent presence, and it was tied to this archive, to these photographs, to me. I had to understand it. I had to find its rules, its weaknesses, its history. My meticulous nature, usually a comfort, now felt like a desperate weapon. The archive, once my sanctuary, became my battleground. I spent the next few days in a blur of frantic research, fueled by strong, bitter coffee and an ever-present hum of unease. I abandoned the neat, organized sections of the main collection. My quarry wasn't in the public records or the easily catalogued. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, filtering through grimy skylights, like tiny, trapped spirits. The smell of aged paper and decaying leather intensified, a cloying scent that clung to my clothes and hair. I found myself in a section rarely disturbed, where shelves sagged under the weight of oversized ledgers bound in cracking pigskin, and fragile parchment scrolls lay nestled in custom boxes. This was where the archive kept its secrets, its curiosities, its embarrassments. I started with the local history, searching for anything anomalous, unexplained disappearances, sudden, inexplicable structural failures in old buildings, odd weather patterns mentioned in centuries-old journals. I cross-referenced dates with the anachronistic photographs I had found, looking for any overlap, any echo. The initial results were frustratingly vague. Then a flicker. In a handwritten account from the late 17th century, detailing a series of livestock mutilations and a sudden illness that swept through the town, the local scribe had added a frantic marginal note. The distortions grow. The fabric thins. My heart gave a lurch. Distortions. Weaver. This was it. I scoured more. The word resonated with the unsettling wrongness of the photographs. The more I read, the more fragmented accounts I unearthed. They were always tied to the archive's location or to certain historical sites that had long since been incorporated into its sprawling grounds. Sometimes, the hints pointed to a specific, forgotten artifact, though its nature remained elusive. I would glance up, convinced I'd heard my name, only to find the empty aisles stretching before me. A book I had just placed on my desk would appear on a shelf across the room, its spine facing the wrong way. My pen, which I'd consciously set beside my notes, would be found tucked inside a completely different volume. These subtle shifts were disorienting, designed to erode my grip on reality. But they also confirmed its presence, its growing proximity. It was watching me, playing with me. One late afternoon, as the last slivers of daylight bled from the sky, I found a particularly disturbing entry in a collection of local ghost stories, compiled in the early 20th century. The Great Iron Heart. I knew exactly what it meant. The boiler room in the basement. The archive's boiler room was a forgotten relic, a vast, cavernous space beneath the oldest section of the building, rarely used since the installation of modern heating systems. It was a place of heavy machinery, dormant now, its vast, rusting boilers like sleeping leviathans. Maintenance staff avoided it, calling it unlucky. No, not unlucky, I realized. Haunted. I grabbed my small, powerful flashlight, its beam a meager defense against the encroaching gloom. The smell changed too, from dusty paper to damp earth and mildewed concrete, overlaid with the metallic tang of rust. The door to the boiler room in the basement was a heavy steel slab, painted a peeling institutional green. The air inside was thick and still, heavy with the scent of old iron and something else, something subtly acrid like burnt ozone. The silence was absolute, yet it pressed in on me, a tangible weight. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, listening. My beam cut through the black, illuminating the monstrous forms of the disused boilers, their pipes snaking like fossilized serpents across the ceiling and walls. The low thrum I'd initially dismissed as my own heartbeat began to intensify, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floor beneath my feet. It was a sound that didn't belong to any machinery, dormant or otherwise. It was a pulse. I swept the light across the far wall, where a series of smaller, older access panels were set into the concrete. One of them, half obscured by a tangle of rusted pipes, was slightly ajar. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer seemed to emanate from within the crack. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold metal, my breath catching in my throat. I felt a growing certainty, a terrifying premonition that whatever I found behind that panel would not be a revelation, but a confirmation of my worst fears, and that it would lead me not to understanding, but deeper into its grasp. The lowest chamber. A shiver, colder than any draft, traced its way down my spine. The archive's boiler room was a forgotten relic, a vast, cavernous space beneath the oldest section of the building, rarely used since the central heating system had been modernized decades ago. The air down here was thick with the scent of rust and damp earth, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. I descended the rickety iron stairs, each step groaning under my weight, a symphony of decay echoing in the vast emptiness. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating cobweb-draped pipes and hulking, dormant machinery. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip-drip-drip of unseen moisture and the frantic thump of my own pulse. The boiler itself, a behemoth of riveted iron, stood like a slumbering beast in the center, its cold surface radiating an ancient chill. This was where the last photograph had pointed, where the great iron heart resided. But what was I supposed to find here? I moved slowly, methodically, my archivist's eye scanning every surface. Dust motes danced in the flashlight's beam like tiny, frantic spirits. There was nothing obvious. No new hidden compartment, no cryptic inscription. My hope, fragile as it was, began to fray. Had I misinterpreted the image? It was then, tucked into a narrow gap between two colossal pipes, almost perfectly camouflaged by a century of grime, that my fingers brushed against something stiff. Not metal, not dust. Paper. My breath hitched. With a delicate touch, I worked it free. It was another photograph, smaller than the others, folded meticulously into quarters. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, the crispness of the paper a stark anomaly in the musty air. The image it held was a sickening twist of the familiar. But this time, the scene wasn't just grotesque. It was personal. My heart seized. It was undeniably my silhouette, my posture, the way my hair fell. I was holding a small, rolled-up document, my head tilted as if listening or perhaps straining to see. The background was not the boiler room, nor any part of the main archive I recognized. It was a passage, narrow and low-ceilinged, lined with rough, unworked stone. A forgotten, sealed-off wing, perhaps, or a sub-basement even deeper than this. The photograph wasn't a warning, I realized with a sickening lurch. It was an invitation. I scrambled back up the iron stairs, the image clutched tight in my hand, the metallic tang of the boiler room now tasting like bile. Sleep offered no refuge. That night, the nightmares came with a new, terrifying intensity. I was in the narrow stone passage, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood. Each step I took in the dream was heavy, unwilling, yet my feet kept moving, a terrible momentum I couldn't resist, pulling me deeper into the stone-lined moor. The waking hours offered little respite. The archive, once my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. The hum from my dreams would return, a phantom vibration in the quiet stacks, barely audible, yet utterly consuming. My focus, usually razor-sharp, was now fractured. I found myself staring blankly at documents, my mind replaying the photograph, the image of my own figure inexorably drawn into the unknown. The compulsion grew, a physical ache in my chest, a profound, unsettling urge to find that passage, to follow the path laid out for me. I would find myself drifting towards the older, less used sections of the archive, my hand reaching for locked doors, my eyes scanning for any hint of a hidden entrance. It wasn't curiosity anymore, not even fear. It was a deep, primal pull, an instinct that overrode all logic. The entity wasn't just showing me the future. It was sculpting it, guiding me, step by agonizing step, into its domain. The photographs were not mere predictions, they were laws. The archive was no longer a place of records, but a labyrinth designed for me, and I was being invited to its heart. Rarely used since the building's last major renovation decades ago. A vast, cavernous space, they said, forgotten and left to rot. And now, the great iron heart, the boiler room in the basement, was calling to me. My fingers still tingled from the touch of the final photograph, the one depicting the impassable machinery, the spiraling coils of rust and steam. It pulsed in my mind, a phantom vibration against my skull. Logic screamed at me to turn back, to ignore the insidious pull, but logic had long since packed its bags and left me to the mercy of this waking nightmare. The compulsion was a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness that only the boiler room could fill. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was an absolute, terrifying necessity. I found the door in a seldom visited corner of the lowest level, tucked behind stacks of condemned furniture and forgotten filing cabinets. It wasn't just closed, it was sealed. Heavy chains, thick with rust and dust, were wrapped around the handles, secured by a padlock that looked as old as the building itself. The air here was colder, stiller, dead. A faint, metallic tang, like old blood and damp earth, permeated the silence. My breath hitched. I hadn't brought tools. But as I reached out, my fingers brushed against a loose link in one of the chains. It wasn't broken, but it felt pliable, as if the metal itself had softened, yielding to an unseen force. With a grunt, I twisted, and to my astonishment, the chain groaned, then snapped, crumbling into flakes of rust that dusted the grimy floor. The padlock, too, seemed to simply give way, shackle collapsing with a soft clink, rather than a sharp crack. It felt less like I was breaking in, and more like the door was simply allowing me passage. The heavy iron door grated open with a shriek that echoed through the empty corridor, a sound like a tortured beast. A wave of stale, humid air washed over me, carrying the scent of decay, damp concrete, and something else, something acrid and metallic, like ozone mixed with something organic, long dead. I stepped inside, my footfalls echoing unnaturally, swallowed by the vastness. The door, heavy and unwilling, swung shut behind me with a final, resonant clang that vibrated through the floor. I was trapped, or perhaps simply where I was meant to be. The boiler room in the basement was not as I remembered it from the brief, functional tour I'd had years ago. The space was immense, far larger than it should have been, stretching into an impassable distance. They twisted and turned, some leading nowhere, others looping back on themselves in Escher-like configurations. Gauges, rusted and cracked, adorned the walls, their needles frozen at absurd readings. Faint at first, like wind through a keyhole, then growing, coalescing into a chorus of indistinct voices. They weren't words I could understand, but a jumble of tones, a child's sob, a man's angry shout, a woman's desperate plea, all layered over each other, impassably close yet impassably far. A flicker, in the periphery of my vision, a brief flash of light, not from my phone, but an internal glow. A scene. A fleeting glimpse of a street, cobblestones wet with rain, horse-drawn carriages, people in outdated clothes rushing past a gas lamp. Temporal distortion, just like the photographs. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure that made my lungs ache. It felt like walking through treacle, each step a monumental effort. There it was. It moved with a liquid grace, never quite solidifying, never quite still. It wasn't leading me. It was simply there, an omnipresent guide to this labyrinth of warped reality. The machinery in the center of the boiler room was unlike anything I had ever seen. This was the great iron heart from the last photograph, and on a pedestal, directly in front of this monstrous engine, was the reveal. Not another photograph, but a single, ancient, leather-bound book. Its cover was blank, its pages seemingly fused together by time and grime. But as I drew closer, the strange green light from the machinery pulsed, and the book began to shimmer. The leather seemed to writhe, and then, slowly, impassably, a single image began to form on its blank surface. It wasn't a static picture. It was a moving tableau, a living photograph, a scene of utter desolation. A barren landscape, littered with the skeletal remains of what looked like a city, reduced to dust. This wasn't just a prediction. It was a memory of a future that felt terrifyingly, inevitably real. My hands trembled, my knees threatened to give way. The entity wasn't just showing me what would be, it was showing me what had been and what would always be. I was staring into the heart of its distortion, and it was staring back. The final photograph. It had been an image not of the past, nor of a twisted future, but of a place. A place I knew, yet had never truly seen. My fingers still tingled from the touch of the heavy stark, the faint impression of a raised symbol on its surface, a swirling glyph that seemed to pull at the air around it. It was a key, a map, a summons. The descent was a plunge into the building's hidden arteries. I followed the faded signs, navigating forgotten corridors where the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp concrete and ancient rust. Each step echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the vast silence that pressed in from all sides. The emergency lights, spaced farther apart down here, cast long, wavering shadows that danced ahead of me, mimicking grotesque figures. The stairs ended abruptly, giving way to a narrow, unlit passage. I fumbled for my phone, its weak beam cutting a hesitant path through the absolute black. The walls here were slick with condensation, the occasional drip landing with a startling plink on the floor. I could hear a low hum, a deep, resonant vibration that I felt more in my teeth than in my ears. It was the building breathing, groaning under an unimaginable strain. Then the archway. It was larger than I'd anticipated, framed by a rusted iron gate that hung askew on a single hinge. Beyond it, the boiler room in the basement yawned open. It wasn't just a room. It was a cathedral of industry, a hulking metallic beast at the very core of the building. The single enormous boiler dominated the space, a riveted iron leviathan stretching towards the high, vaulted ceiling. Its surface was a patchwork of grime and flaking paint, but beneath it, I could discern the faint outline of the same swirling glyph I'd seen on the photograph. The low hum I'd heard intensified, a discordant chord vibrating through the very floor beneath my worn boots. This was it, the heart of the malevolence. I stepped over the threshold, my breath catching in my throat. Instead, the air itself seemed to ripple, to distort. Then the visions began. They weren't flashes, but immersive realities, pulling me in with sickening speed. One moment I was standing in the archive, the familiar scent of aged paper in my nostrils, arguing with a colleague about a misfiled document, a petty, mundane disagreement. But then the colleague's face stretched, their features elongating into something monstrous, their eyes black pools of accusation. You didn't see it. Their voice boomed, distorted. You chose not to see it. The memory fractured, revealing a hidden layer of indifference. A moment when I dismissed a flicker of unease, a misplaced photo as nothing more than a trick of the light, a profound regret sharpened to a razor's edge. Another vision, my childhood home, bathed in the golden light of a summer evening. My parents' laughter, warm and comforting. I reached out, desperate to touch that tangible memory, to feel the fleeting warmth. But as my fingers neared, the scene warped. The laughter turned to screams, the golden light to a sickly green, and the house began to buckle, to fold in on itself like a collapsing paper model. "This is what you protect," a voice hissed, not from the colleague, but from everywhere and nowhere. "A fragile illusion. This is what you lost." The entity was showing me not just what I regretted, but the inherent vulnerability of all I held dear, twisting my past into a weapon. My head reeled. My knees threatened to give out. My chest felt like a trapped bird beating against its cage. The air grew thick, pressing in, making each breath a struggle. I saw myself, older, alone, surrounded by the crumbling ruins of the city, my hands reaching out to grasp at dust. I am a thread, nothing more. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the onslaught, but the visions were within me, behind my eyelids, etched onto my very consciousness. I tasted bile at the back of my throat. This wasn't just an attack on my mind. It was an attempt to dismantle my very self, to break my will. But even as despair threatened to consume me, a stubborn spark ignited. The glyph. It wasn't just a symbol on the boiler. It was a mirror image of the symbol on the back of the photograph itself, the one I'd found tucked into the oldest ledger. It had felt cool, almost damp to the touch, unlike the dry, brittle paper of the ledger. I forced my eyes open. The boiler room in the basement was a kaleidoscope of warping realities, but my gaze fixed on the ancient boiler. The glyph was there, subtly glowing with a faint internal luminescence. And beneath it, nestled in a small, almost invisible recess in the iron, was something else. It was a small, ornate pocket watch. It pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, mirroring the horrific vision of my collapsing home. This wasn't just an artifact. It was the artifact, the nexus. Reaching it meant navigating the entity's assault, pushing through the suffocating weight of projected despair. Every step was a battle against my own mind. My legs felt heavy, my muscles screamed with phantom pain, but I focused on the watch. Its sickly glow was a beacon, a target. As I neared, the entity intensified its attack. A vision of my own death, sudden and brutal, flickered before my eyes, then another, a long, agonizing decline into madness. It wanted me to give up, to surrender to the inevitability of its power. I reached out, my hand trembling. The watch pulsed faster, a frantic heartbeat. To sever the connection, to break this cycle, I knew what I had to do. The ritual wasn't a series of arcane words, but an act of profound self-destruction, but one that would hopefully save others. My fingers closed around the watch. The entity roared, a soundless scream that vibrated through my bones. I felt it trying to pull me back, to shatter my grip, to flood my mind with every single fear I'd ever known. I had to sacrifice a part of myself, a piece of my own timeline, my own connection to the past. The only way to sever its hold on time was to willingly sever my own, to become untethered. With a defiant gasp, I crushed the watch in my hand. The metal groaned, protesting, the carvings digging deep into my skin. A sharp, agonizing pain shot through my arm, then my chest, then my head. And then the unraveling began, not of the entity, but of me. The taste of bile, sharp and acrid, clung to my tongue. My throat burned, raw from a scream I hadn't known I'd uttered. The visions, a maelstrom of fractured moments and impassable futures, had receded, leaving behind a hollow echo in the cavern of my skull. My eyes, squeezed shut with desperate force, now felt glued, refusing to open, as if protecting me from a reality they could no longer comprehend. My body was a leaden weight, sprawled on the cold concrete floor of the boiler room in basement, every muscle screaming in protest. The air, thick with the metallic tang of old pipes and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten things, pressed in on me. No longer did I hear the frantic hiss of steam or the groaning of ancient machinery, only the frantic, ragged cadence of my own breathing. Each inhale was a shallow gasp, each exhale a shudder. Slowly, cautiously, I forced my eyelids apart. The dim, grimy light of the single bare bulb hanging overhead seemed impassably bright, searing my pupils. Dust motes danced in its weak glow, suspended in the stagnant air like tiny, indifferent spirits. The boiler, a colossal iron beast, stood silent, its rusted valves and gauges marking the chaos that had just unfolded. Nothing was overtly broken, no walls shattered, no pipes burst. The physical world remained stubbornly intact, a stark contrast to the wreckage within me. A tremor ran through my limbs as I pushed myself up, my hands scraping against the rough floor. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. I felt like a sculpture carved from the inside, leaving only the fragile shell. Yet, beneath the profound exhaustion, a strange clarity began to emerge. The onslaught hadn't been about destruction, not entirely. It had been an attempt at assimilation, at breaking my perception, forcing me to become part of its temporal tapestry. And I had resisted. This was the reveal. The entity wasn't a physical being to be fought with fists or fire. It was a parasite of chronology, a disruption that fed on the unraveling threads of time, growing stronger with every paradox, every anachronism it wove into existence. It didn't exist in time, but between asterisk it, a predatory echo. My refusal to yield, to accept its distorted reality, had starved it at least for now. It had retreated, not defeated, but denied its feast. I had survived not by conquering it, but by denying it victory over my mind. That was the truth. It was a battle of will and perception, and I had, by some miracle, held my ground. The event of leaving the boiler room in basement was an odyssey. Every step was a conscious act of defiance against the inertia that threatened to pin me to the spot. My legs, stiff and uncooperative, stumbled on the uneven concrete. It felt too quiet, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for the next tremor. When I finally reached the main floor, the familiar rows of shelves, the scent of aged paper and dust, were both comforting and profoundly alien. The morning light, filtering through the tall windows, seemed muted, as if the world itself had turned down its volume. My colleagues, the archivist and the assistant, were already at their desks, their mundane chatter a distant, almost incomprehensible hum. They looked up, their expressions shifting from polite curiosity to concern as they took in my disheveled appearance, my bloodshot eyes, the faint tremor in my hands. "Kai, are you all right?" the archivist asked, his voice laced with genuine worry. I managed a weak, hoarse sound that might have been fine. I couldn't explain. How could I articulate a war fought in the landscape of my own consciousness? How could I describe an entity that ate time? They would see only a colleague pushed to the brink, perhaps by stress, perhaps by something worse. I nodded, a jerky motion, and stumbled towards my desk, collapsing into my chair. The days that followed blurred into a hazy continuum of enforced normalcy. I went through the motions, cataloging documents, retrieving files, my hands moving with an automated precision that belied the turmoil within. The immediate threat, the direct assault, seemed to have ceased. The archive settled back into its quiet rhythm, the air no longer thrumming with unseen energy. But the world, for me, was irrevocably changed. It was never distinct, never fully formed, just a momentary ripple in the reflection, a hint of something vast and hungry lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. And the anachronisms. They were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A photograph of a 19th century street scene, and for a split second, I'd swear I saw a digital watch on the wrist of a passerby. A historical newspaper article detailing a local event, and a phrase, a turn of speech, would feel jarringly modern, out of place. My mind, once a meticulous archive of facts and dates, now seemed perpetually attuned to these temporal dissonances. I would blink, look again, and the anomaly would be gone, replaced by the expected, the correct. Was it truly there, or was my perception permanently fractured, forever seeing the world through the entity's warped lens? I didn't know. I only knew that I was alive, but not whole. The archive was quiet. The world seemed normal, but for Kai, the meticulous young archivist, normalcy was a lie I now had to live, forever marked by the encounter with time itself.